So today is November 23rd, 2021. My name is Kevin, and I'm with the Houston Asian American Archive. And I'll be talking today with Rachna Khare, who's the Executive Director of DAYA, an organization that is dedicated to helping South Asian individuals and families that face domestic violence and or abuse. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we get into Daya, I would just like to ask how you got interested in women's rights and helping those that face domestic violence in the first place. Like, did the
Yeah,
interest kind of develop early on or kind of develop when you were older?
I would say it's a little bit of both. I found that even when I was a younger child, when things were unfair, that really confused me, if that makes sense. And I was always really passionate about fairness. And what I learned later was equity. And then throughout my career, I was working in research, actually, in bio, bioengineering research. And I was working in global health at Rice University, actually. And we were working on like maternal and neonatal health issues. So that really inspired me to think deeper about the inequities that exist across the world, including here, for women and particularly women of color, the barriers that they face.
You mentioned kind of how you were involved in like research. So can you kind of tell us more about like your previous employment and kind of how it led up to,
Yeah,
I guess, where
it's
you are now?
actually I never thought that it's really interesting. When I first started college and I went to the University of Texas at Austin, I started as a communications major, and coming from Houston, which is such a diverse city, and in high school, I was very involved in different leadership clubs, and I was on student council, and it was always really diverse. And when I got to the University of Texas at Austin, it wasn't as diverse. I mean, Austin is not as diverse as Houston, and I really felt a little out of place as a communications major. I wasn't able to pinpoint it at the time, but there just wasn't anybody, or there weren't many people that looked like me, or I just felt like I didn't really belong. And where what I did was I changed my major and I went into the sciences, and because that's where many of my friends were. And I got a biology degree thinking maybe I'll do something in the allied health, optometry or physical therapy, something in that vein. And right after college, I got one of my first job in as a research associate. I think that was what it was called. And it was at a psychology lab, and we were looking at gender differences and things like that. And really I liked it. I liked that you got to kind of look at data and look at numbers, and it was very like analytical. And I also like that you got to interact with people. And so from there, I worked as a clinical trials coordinator and then manager at MD Anderson Cancer Center here in Houston. And that project took me to the same role, or I'm sorry, like a bigger role, but same project at Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York, and then back to Rice University on the technology side. And after that, I was working with Dr. Rebecca Richards Cordham, who is a great mentor of mine, a professor at Rice University, and so much more, and just a really inspirational woman. And I looked at the work she was doing around in the Global Health Institute, so at Rice 360, and really wanted to be a part of it. And although I am not a bioengineer, she knew my work through being her research coordinator for many years, and hired me on as a project manager, and then later on as the executive director of Rice 360. And so what that did was it really took the shift from kind of like the hard sciences to more of looking at determinants of health and behaviors around choices that people make or can't make around their health due to barriers they face related to gender quite often. And that's how I really became interested in nonprofit work. And I wanted to do something more local. And Rice 360 was growing so much, and I really and continue to love really grassroots efforts. And I love work that's a little bit more like focused and not as I really like small teams and so when I left Rice 360, I saw the position open at that and I said, wow, I wanted something focused and I wanted something local. And this was exactly that. So it was very serendipitous, the timing of it all.
And would you say kind of like the skill set you developed, like in managing, like kind of translated really well?
Yeah,
Mhm.
it really does. I credit, all of my mentors, which is really in my work, the professors and the doctors that I worked with and for, because they let me dig in to some of the areas that I wasn't necessarily like hired to do. Definitely like not my job description to look at budgets and look at data in such a deep way and really and you'll know because you're at Rice. There is such a celebration of learning and of teaching. And so I learned so many skills, everything from the kind of harder, like the more like hard science stuff, when it comes to looking and determining metrics and data, which is still used in my work today, creating budgets, but then also like learning how to work with different stakeholders, how to interact with the board of directors, how to write grants. And really that is because I asked, can I take a shot at this? And every one of the incredible people I've been able to work for said, yeah, like, take a shot at it, and gave me great and honest and constructive feedback that just really let me grow those skills and get like more confident in it. And that's what I brought to the interview at Daya. I said, I've done all these years of this because there's been so many incredible people that let me try it out.
I guess that would be perfect time to segue into, I guess, your roles and responsibilities in the organization, and kind of have these like roles changed throughout the years.
Yeah, so I've been with Daya for 5 years now. And when we started, our budget was less than, it was about $400,000, $440,000. And it was a completely volunteer board run organization, which is tremendous. And, serving over 250 clients a year at the time. And it's amazing because these were all folks who were doing it as volunteer time. There was a staff, but the big picture vision strategy was defined by volunteers, and the fundraising was done by volunteers who were that passionate about it. And since then, what I so appreciate about the board at Daya, the founders, the past board members, the current board members, is we all believe in growth, but we all are very mission oriented. We always come back to the mission. We always believe that growth should happen in steps so that we are careful to not undo any of the great work that's been done before us. And now, now I'm leading and it's such a privilege to lead a team of 12. Our budget is over $1 million now. We have extensive federal funding and have just really grown our footprint in the city of Houston and in the communities across Texas, really. So it has grown quite a bit. I think the biggest place of growth was learning how to manage state funds and federal funds. That was new. And really leaning into a new kind of leadership style with the support of our board, instead of running the organization sort of hierarchical, top down. It is a culturally specific organization. And I thought, and I'd done a lot of reading and learning from incredible activists and people in our community who challenged me a bit and said, why does, a grassroots organization doesn't have to run like a corporation. It doesn't have to be this top down, and we don't have to follow, structures that were created by white men or people that these structures weren't created for us. And so we were able to slowly build a more lateral structure, and there's so much power sharing that happens. And it's really obviously I'm biased, but it's a beautiful and incredible place to work, where everyone's opinions are not only valued, but all the decision making is done through consensus decision making. And so again, it's about slowing down and looking at what everybody brings to the table, and not just like who's the boss and what the org chart says.
So beyond kind of like leadership, how is I guess the organization structured in terms of like helping clients? Do you like train volunteers, or how does
Yeah,
that
we
work?
do a little bit of everything. And so right now, our bread and butter has always been about mental health services and case management. So helping survivors navigate different systems, legal system, housing system, criminal justice system, benefits, food, transportation, all of those needs. It's been helping, that's always been kind of the bread and butter, that, the trauma-informed counseling, and then the really wraparound case management services, and that still remains. That's kind of the bulk of what we do, especially with, it's all done with a cultural lens though. And for me, what that means is that many of the survivors that we're working with, their culture is a part of their trauma. The way their families, their extended families, their community, their faith communities, the way that those people helped or didn't help when they were experiencing, or as they experienced domestic violence or sexual assault or dating violence, that plays into their trauma. The trauma becomes not just from the abuser, but also from society. And so we consider that as we work with clients, and we wear that cultural lens to really understand what all is at play. And we also try to use the strengths of our culture to bring about healing and justice in different kinds of ways. And so it's the counseling and case management is language specific, but it's also culturally specific. We also have an incredible legal clinic, which is volunteer attorneys who are donating their time to give free legal consultations, to represent clients in their family law cases and their custody cases. And these are folks that not only know about domestic violence, but they also know about the South Asian culture and the cultural nuances. We also provide rental assistance. So we're really choice-based. Again, we want to be an organization that lets clients lead their path to healing. And what that looks like is, okay, let's think about what your income could be in a year, and then finding a place, and perhaps us providing often it's us providing rental assistance from anywhere from 3 months to about 18 months. And then that gives that safety net, so clients can work on their mental health. They can build up their income. They can find economic justice. 90% of them 99% of survivors have experienced financial abuse, where their abusers are controlling all of the money. And so they're starting, I don't like to say they're starting from scratch, because they're starting from a place of such resilience and experience. But materially, they're starting with very little. And so providing that rental assistance is a really great way to help people build up. And we see, we see a lot of success in people who they're resilient enough to come forward to leave an abusive relationship. And that's kind of the hardest step because it's so against the grain. And after that, because of the world we live in, money becomes a big deal. But once we start putting some material investments into our clients, they're able to do really powerful things in terms of building safety, not only for their family, but for the entire community. Because domestic violence is not, of course, not just in one family, it really impacts all of us.
And kind of with regards to like the programs you were talking about for those facing, domestic abuse, violence, like financial abuse, etc. What are some, I guess, common like roadblocks or challenges that you
I
face?
think, there's no survivor that's turned away from DIA. We support anyone who calls us, understanding that it's a tough call to make, and it's not a safe call to make, right? You have to do it super carefully. However, our expertise is around the South Asian culture. And so what I think the roadblocks we see the most is, it kind of varies, but when we're looking at new immigrants, immigration status becomes huge. Something like, I think it's between 65 and 75% of immigrants who are victims of domestic violence, they actually have a spouse who did not file the proper paperwork for them, leaving them undocumented, at least for some period of time. So that becomes a major challenge, especially if they have children that are born in the US. They don't want to be separated from those children, obviously. And they definitely don't want the children to be in the custody of an abusive parent. And so with that in mind, that is a huge barrier for folks. The other biggest barrier for new immigrants especially is lack of work history, lack of rental history, and language barriers. And even for people who are in their 50s and 60s, many times they've been in this relationship for a long time and they haven't been able or allowed to work. Their movements have been closely monitored, and their abusers threaten them if they try to form social circles or get a job. And so that becomes a huge barrier. Systematically, though, I would say that our country's legal system is tough. Family law cases are tough in Texas. It's very rare for people to have full custody or no visitation rights, even if that person was an abusive spouse, because being abusive spouse doesn't mean they were an abusive parent. In the eyes of the legal system, that's definitely a disagreement our movement has with the legal system. But we see that there's these systems failures, lack of affordable housing, inability to qualify for various public benefits, being an immigrant, not being able to be on Medicare, not being eligible for SNAP benefits or TANF. It becomes a problem of material support. And that's really where we try to plug in as much as we can. And that's where we really try to do a lot of work around prevention. So our outreach and education program is out in the community talking about red flags, ways to protect yourself, ways to protect your finances, even before you're in a relationship, right? And so, and those are some of the other tools that we're using to fight this big world of capitalism in which money is so incredibly important, to be able to survive.
So I guess like stepping back, if we were to think of like a hypothetical situation where, a woman is suffering from, abuse, like calls the organization, I guess what's the initial process, or how do you get started with that?
Yeah, so there's multiple ways where in which survivors of really any gender, any background, any sexual orientation any age can reach us. They can call our helpline, they can reach us through our website, or they can send an email. All three ways are kept completely confidential. We've had folks reach out to us using our social media platforms, and we kind of quickly move them into a more confidential space. We find that digital monitoring is a huge problem. And so we encourage people to, maybe this is the only way you can reach out, but then let's delete that message and get you, teach you how to create a new email address and start working that way. And then, the initial intake is usually about 20 to 40 minutes, somewhere in there. And we really, everything we do is very survivor led. So we, of course, get some demographic information just to see kind of what, who somebody is on paper. And then we really let them tell us what their story is. Maybe not super in depth on that first call, because it can be really hard, but we just try to get like, what is the immediate needs? Are you looking for legal support? Are you looking for mental health support, housing support? Have you fled already? Are you still with the abuser? Are you interested in fleeing? Are you ready to flee? And so we get all of that information, and then as a team, we quickly kind of assign each client to a client advocate or a counselor, and that becomes their one-on-one person. And really, that is the most important therapeutic relationship. Those two people, the client and the advocate, work in tandem together, to hear what the goals are of the survivor. And then we, as advocates doing the work for so long, can offer options. And then we go through like, what are the potential consequences of each of those options, or what might happen. It's a pretty long process. We have clients that stay with us for many, many years. We have some that just stay with us for a few months. We have some that, are able to kind of get through one situation, but find themselves needing our services again. And all of that, doors always open for those things. But typically, in that first few calls, it's about getting their history of abuse and even generational violence that may have happened in their families, what their needs are, and then providing some education that most survivors find very validating about what the cycle of abuse looks like, why people are abusive, how it is not their fault, how it can happen to anybody. And then always the goal is around safety planning. So it is looking at their specific situation and saying, let's walk through your whole life, let's walk through your day-to-day life and figure out in each situation, in each moment of your day-to-day life, how are you protecting yourself as much as you can? How are you improving your safety to the maximum extent? So it's very creative. It's very, and it's the clients that get super creative. I mean, they know their experience best. So we'll have like little ideas that we throw out there, and they'll take those ideas and really transform them into very robust plans for safety.
You kind of mentioned how some clients, like, they come back after like one issue is resolved. How common is that?
So at Daya, we see it. However, what we see more often is that like a client stays with us for a long, long time. On average, it takes somebody 9 times to leave before they leave for good. There's tons of reasons for that. A lot of times it's related to, I can't, there's no shelter space. I can't afford housing. I don't have sometimes it's material stuff, right? Like I don't have the money to survive. Sometimes it's the emotional stuff. I love this person. They've said they're not going to do this anymore, and I believe them, and I want to give them another chance. And, we are a family. So sometimes it's that. So it's a multitude of reasons that people, and also it's really important to know that when someone flees, that's actually the most risky time. That's where your risk for homicide is the highest. And that's because the abuser is like, oh no, I'm losing control. And at its core, domestic violence is all about power and control. So when they see somebody leaving the relationship, they start to panic and they start to really see that they're losing that control they have over their partner. And what happens then is the abuse will escalate. They will lock them in rooms. They will threaten their lives. They will, take away their cars, their money, so they really create barriers there. It is very, very common for people to also leave one abusive relationship and enter another one. And that's just, history of patterns. And that's why it's so important for us to do that education piece on like, what are the red flags, right? Because nobody starts off being deeply abusive. What happens is it builds up over time, and it is, and that's very purposeful. Abusive people know that if they start off being very extremely harmful, both physically or emotionally, that the person will have the support to leave. However, once you have a family together, once you've isolated them from their friends and their family, once you've convinced them that, oh no, you shouldn't work and your role should be to stay at home. Once you've really kind of created a system where somebody is very isolated, it is really difficult to leave. And then if they leave, it becomes the easier thing to do is to go back. It is the easier thing. And sometimes, we have Hurricane Harvey, we had the winter storm, we have COVID. Sometimes you have to do the thing that is going to keep you and your children physically safe in terms of roof over your head, food on the table. And that's a big reason too why people return back to abusive relationships.
You mentioned how education is like so pivotal to identify abuse. In like kind of compiling that, or have you noticed, I guess, throughout the years, like any change in how domestic abuse is like carried out or how it is kind of evolved?
Yeah. I personally, I was going to say I personally haven't, but there are some places. I mean, I think COVID was a huge eye-opening moment for me where I really, really saw how financial abuse is like so incredibly devastating. What I saw during COVID, as people especially at the beginning, as stores were closing and you can't work retail and all of those things, restaurants were closing, all of that. I really, really saw how that, if somebody loses their job and then the other partner can really leverage that, they can really leverage the finances. So then what we saw, I mean, we would see abusers say, oh, well, we can only afford to have one cell phone. And so you're not going to have a cell phone anymore. And so you're hiding under the guise of being, frugal or saving money, but really it's about control, and we saw that, yes, we were all asked to stay home as much as possible, avoid any gatherings, avoid leaving your home. And that became like a really like a very convincing way for abusers to keep their partners under close lock and key. It became, no, you can't go to the mosque or the temple because COVID. You can't go see your family because COVID. You can't FaceTime because we can only have the one phone. You can FaceTime using my phone, and that's just another way to be able to control somebody. So I think what I'm seeing, and of course it's, I haven't worked in the movement for decades like so many of my mentors have, but I see that the more divided our country gets in terms of economy, the bigger that income gap gets, as people are people are suffering financial abuse more and more because that is the way to keep somebody controlled, because at the end of the day, we need a place to live. And if you're homeless if you're having to live on the streets, and you have a child, but your partner is living in a nice home, the courts are going to say that that's where that child gets to live. And so it is a very compelling way. It is kind of like who holds the money holds the power. And so in that regard, we are really trying to build up our economic justice program and really do a lot of prevention work in the community with young adults and with adults of all ages, including elders, around why economic independence is so important. And that despite what marriages or couples or families used to look like, the reality is that you do need to have your own autonomy when it comes. The way we have to have autonomy with our body is the same way we have to have autonomy with our finances to a certain extent. So even if you are, even if you're a stay-at-home mom, even if you are, a husband who is unemployed at the time, you have to be part of each and every financial decision as well. And you should always have access to that money, and you should always have all the information and all the passwords and all of those things. And you can't, we don't have the ability to just kind of turn a blind eye and say, oh, that person takes care of it. My husband or my wife or my partner takes care of all of the finances, because it's just, it's such an incredibly critical skill. And it's important that the young people in our lives see that folks of all gender identities have the responsibility to have those skills around financial control and have financial autonomy. Now, once you're in an abusive relationship, you have to give that up sometimes in order to keep yourself alive and safe. But if we can start to build a cultural norm where this responsibility belongs to everybody, we would be able, survivors would be in a much better position to be able to take more control over their lives. Nobody wants to be harmed by the person that they love, at all, and then especially by the person that they love. And a lot of times the trap, the reason why people are trapped is really because of the finances. And then also in our community, the stigma against leaving a relationship is another thing that we're trying to tackle.
And, with regards to this financial abuse issue, do you have any, I guess, special programming to tackle that?
We do. We've been slowly building this out. A couple of years ago, actually, it was before COVID, we started to see, and this isn't new. I mean, every domestic violence agency, we're always like, oh my gosh, if only somebody could have their own bank account, all of these things. And then we're working with a predominantly immigrant population, and often, and sometimes undocumented, and then it becomes, and often with no ID, and it becomes even harder to open a bank account, right, without your spouse kind of knowing about it. Some of the programs that we have, really, it's involved in that one-on-one case management. We do a lot of work with credit unions and banks that allow us to help survivors open private bank accounts. We do a lot of education around what's the difference between a checking account and a savings account. What is credit? Why is it important? We have so many clients, I would say probably 100%, have had an abuser that has opened up some form of debt in their name. And it's not fraud, because they did indeed sign the piece of paper, but under such coercion and duress, right? And so we do a lot of work on rebuilding credit. We rely heavily on our housing partners, wonderful landlords in the community who say, okay, we get it. And even though this person's credit is terrible, we'll let them sign a lease here. And that's through partnerships and relationships that we build. The other thing that we're planning for later this year is, and we were planning it for last year, but of course COVID, but is a 2-day financial freedom seminar that really focuses not only on survivors of domestic violence, but really folks in the South Asian and other similar immigrant communities, so that they can really get that kind of baseline knowledge that's so critical. And then on top of that, some breakout sessions where people can learn about high interest savings accounts and retirement and life insurance and all different kinds of things that, especially if you are a first generation immigrant, and then like me, a second generation immigrant, a lot of times it wasn't discussed in our families, like money is such like a hush hush topic. So really what we're trying to do is break that silence around, around, we call it the other F word, right? The financials, because it's just a thing that just, even growing up in a home that I, with such strong, my family has incredibly healthy and strong relationships, but we did not discuss money at all, and so I think that is quite a detriment. And so what we're trying to do is start those conversations at kind of every level and meet people where they are. So, if you don't know the difference between a checking account, or you don't know how to write a check, that's okay. We can learn that together. And then people start to really build their confidence around finances. What I think is that it becomes such a scary topic because it's intimidating, and you don't want to feel dumb. And so that's why I think doing this work in a space like DIA, which is so trauma informed around your abuse experience, it's a great place to learn it, and it's a great place to practice, because you can mess up and it's okay. We do a lot of budgeting work, expenses versus income, work around savings, how to direct deposits, all kinds of things that people just may not have ever heard or learned about.
I guess to talk more about kind of like the integrated approach, how you talk about kind of partnerships. Has your organization kind of partnered with other organizations in the Houston area? For example, like women's centers, and if so, like what kind of benefits have come out of that?
Yeah, we love, and I really do. I'm so proud. I'm a Houstonian myself, and I've always been so proud of the Houston nonprofit community, because it's such a collaborative space, and there's so much friendship and sharing that happens between various organizations. And so we've collaborated with mainstream organizations, all of the women's shelters, the Women's Resource, which is an incredible financial institution, mental health organizations, places like that are mainstream, and law enforcement, legal community, all of that. And what happens is we find that we at DIA become more informed about all of the programs and opportunities out there for low income folks and survivors of abuse. And then on the flip side, we're able to teach our friends at these mainstream agencies about the nuances in the South Asian culture, and where a survivor may be coming from, and what some of those cultural barriers are, and what some of these unique risks are when it comes to survivors of domestic violence. And so ultimately the whole system becomes stronger. We're more culturally competent, we are more resourced. And then we work with the culturally specific agencies too, with Olive Branch Muslim Family Services, with the Chinese Community Center, with OCA of Greater Houston, the Interfaith Ministries, the list kind of goes on. And in that regard, they may not be the expert on domestic violence. And so they're able to send us great referrals. That we don't want people to have to take on an issue this big that requires so much mental health support and such in-depth counseling. And instead we say, yes, send them our way. And in turn, we're able to also tap into lots of the resources that they have. They have car programs, um, financial programs, technology programs, and we're able to enroll, the clients that we're serving are able to enroll in those and reap the benefits of that. So without partnerships, it truly wouldn't happen.
I know you mentioned that DIA helps, individuals, all individuals, but it is like culturally specific. So I kind of want to ask a few, I guess, more culturally specific
Yeah.
questions. And the first, I guess, is how do South Asians, either, immigrants or those who are born here, face domestic abuse or violence in ways that are kind of different, or if there is any difference at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Mention.
I would say whenever there's two threads that I think of that really tie so many of our clients' experiences together. The first one being this immense cultural taboo against breaking a marriage or breaking a family. To that, I like to say, this family was already broken, right? So a survivor kind of seeking help or leaving is actually a form of repair and restoration rather than a break. However, there is this common thread of what are people going to say? What are people going to think? And that is so real in the South Asian community that, that phrase in Hindi is like on t-shirts. It's, because it's so ubiquitous across the community. And that becomes the biggest thing that it is, I'm going to let my parents down. I'm going to be letting my community down. My friends aren't going to want to be, my friends aren't going to want to be friends with a divorced person, and their spouses aren't going to want them to be friends with a divorced person, right? And that's very real. It's not a perceived fear. That is actually what we see happen. Like, that's what happens. People lose their entire social circles. And that is a huge similarity across South Asian communities that I'm sure happens across other communities as well. But I think it is such a, it's incredibly ubiquitous in our culture. And the second one is in-law abuse. I think that in the South Asian community, similar to many Asian communities, there is this sense of collectivism over individualism. And we live in extended family homes back in the home country, and often here in the US as well. And even if we're not living in the same home, we're living in the same neighborhoods, and it's very intermingled. And there are, for better or for worse, there's not many boundaries around families. It isn't like, I've talked to a lot of my white American friends about this, and they're like, oh, the fact that like your mom has a key to your house. And I'm like, oh, that would be crazy if she didn't, And so there's, the boundaries just look different because the family is defined in a broader way. What that leads to, unfortunately, I mean, in some ways it's a beautiful thing. You would think that you could then count on more people for support. However, that stigma is stronger, I think, at the moment, at least in most families, than is the need to support. But the in-law abuse becomes incredibly prevalent. Over 90% of our clients experience abuse from multiple perpetrators that are not just their spouse, but typically the mother-in-law, the father-in-law, often siblings as well. That abuse is physical. It's it can be deeply emotional too. It's very psychological. See a lot of close monitoring. So if the spouse is at work, the mother-in-law is at home monitoring everything that survivor is doing, criticizing everything, lots of gaslighting, making them feel like they're crazy, a lot of stalking, following them, tracking their movements through their phone or through their car. And so really the abuser has like this whole team of people supporting that control. And it becomes very difficult to flee. In in many communities, it's no doubt about it, every survivor becomes very isolated from friends and family. However, I think that this extra monitoring, control, pressure, abuse from the in-laws makes it that much harder to find that tiny window of time to be able to flee. And this whole time, they're getting in your head and sort of making you think differently and question your own reality through gaslighting. And it becomes that much harder to flee. And you're told that this is normal. This is what marriage looks like. This is what relationships look like. You're just being a bad daughter-in-law in most cases when there's in-law abuse. It happens quite often to the daughters. And by the mother-in-law. I always think it's interesting because all these mother-in-laws experienced this as well. And instead of stopping this cycle in our community, we often keep it going. It's really a shame that we can't stop that mother-in-law abuse to the daughter-in-law. And that's very, very prevalent. And I will tell you that if you call a mainstream agency and say, oh, my mother-in-law is, emotionally or psychologically abusing me, they will be very empathetic to your situation, but that isn't going to get you into a shelter. That's not you are not eligible for most housing programs out there unless you're experiencing abuse from your intimate partner. And that doesn't include the in-laws in that situation. With Daya, it's we see less clients because we are culturally specific and people know that. And however, that gives us the liberty to really hone in on what's happening in our community and address those really unique types of abuse that are going on, those unique types of violence. And then and I think something that happens across communities of color is distrust and unfair outcomes within the system. We've seen police officers ask abusers to be the translator for the victim when they come out to a police call. Just horrible practices, right? We've seen people judged and belittled due to language barriers, accents, what they're wearing, if they have a head covering, if they aren't making direct eye contact, things are very common in our culture are used against them in mainstream systems. And it's, I guess from a lack of education and also because of the deep, the deep racial bias that exists in all of these systems that just truly were not built for us. They really weren't.
And so would you say that, I guess, the main pro of having like a culturally specific organization is just being able to understand and like identify and help those with, like culturally specific issues or problems?
Yeah, I think it's really great. What we've heard from survivors that we work with is that it's felt very good to be able to come into a space and not have to like explain your culture. And then also, how it's very interesting. Like it's like sometimes they'll get like if they're working with a mainstream agency, and again, it's not from bad intentions, but it's like, oh my gosh, like I can't believe your mom would cut you off because you left your abusive husband. But then now you're saying something bad about my mom, who I also love, right? And so I think being in a space where you don't have to explain your culture, you don't have to stand up for your culture, because you really don't. I mean, you come to a place like Daya and we just understand it, and it is very like it's very neutral. It's like it is just how it is. We're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like your mom isn't talking to you anymore. Your father has cut you off. Your sisters won't. Like you have no family support. We don't say, oh my gosh, what a tragedy. If only your culture was different. We honor that and hold space for it, and then and there's no blame given really on either side.
This is a very culturally specific question, but one of my colleagues told me that I guess now it's like increasingly more common in, I guess, the Indian community to, for, I guess, for young couples to have met themselves before getting
Mm,
married, as opposed to an arranged marriage. I don't
yeah,
really have a statistic to back that up, but
yeah.
has this shift kind of changed abuse or, violence?
You know where it's so fascinating because when somebody is in, it goes both ways. When someone's in an arranged marriage and the relationship becomes abusive, my logic as a person who grew up here, um, with parents who are in an arranged marriage, my logic would think if if my parents arranged my marriage and I ended up with an abusive partner, that I would be like, I got to get out of this thing. And I wouldn't feel the guilt around it because I would be like, you arranged this. I didn't pick this, And so, however, it is very difficult when you're in an arranged marriage to come forward when there's abuse, because it's the marrying of kind of two families. And there's so much like riding on this, and at the end of the day, there is a difference between arranged marriage and forced marriage. And that's a very gray area because many people, when they look back on their life, if they've had an arranged marriage, they struggle with how much of this was coerced. What choice did I have? Now, when you find your own partner and you say, okay, we're getting married, and then you do your own thing, and that relationship becomes abusive, it becomes equally as hard to come forward, because then what you have to what I think what people fear is their parents saying, well, you should have just done it our way. Look at the divorce rate across arranged marriages, which may or may not be. I also don't know the statistics around that, but I've heard many people in the community say, oh, well, there's very few divorces across arranged marriages. And I'm like, well, yeah, there's a huge stigma against divorce. And so, that's why. And but what I think happens is that, and this, I see a parallel here between kind of going against the grain by having what's called a love marriage in the Indian community, and also with the LGBT community who are South Asian, because it takes a lot of courage to do something that is against a cultural norm. And then you want to protect that choice at all costs, and it feels really bad to say, like, yes, I fought so hard for this, and now it isn't working out, or at worst, and now it's harming me. And so I think that that's also the case. So when there's love marriages that start off with dating and all those regular things, the risk of domestic violence remains the same. And I think that the barriers are different for leaving that relationship, but they both have barriers, unfortunately.
So at this point, I guess I have a few like more wrap up, like general questions. And the first, I guess, is, the pandemic is, well, we're still kind of in the pandemic, but has it introduced any like challenges or hardships? And, if so, how did you kind of remedy those?
Yeah, we've realized that like how critical technology access is. And I've been saying before the pandemic, I always thought it was that internet access should be an essential utility. I've kind of been saying that for a long time, because even as before pandemic, as clients were trying to get jobs, like, you need the internet. Like, this idea of like walking into a place and saying, are you hiring, and let me have an application. I mean, people will look at you like, what? And then most places aren't doing that stuff on paper anymore. And what the pandemic showed us is just how critical internet access and technology access is. What we did is we, obviously had to go remote because of the shutdowns and all those things, and the safety of our staff and of our clients as well. But what we tried to do, and what we successfully did, was get laptops into the hands of clients who could safely hide them or have them. And that became a really beneficial thing. Again, working closely with our housing partners to say, hey, can they have like an office in the your leasing office? Can they have a room in there to do their counseling appointment? And we really started doing things a lot remotely, and that has remained, because the other problem, a huge problem in Houston, is public transportation. And if you live in Sugar Land, that you can't even take a bus to get into the city, right? And so that ability to do remote services has been really positive in that way. It's been very hard because counseling is, especially the counseling that we do around psychological abuse, emotional abuse, all the different kinds of violence people are facing, is so heavy and triggering, and not being able to read body language or not being able to like sit together can be a little bit difficult, but we're learning and making compromises and finding solutions there. Where I think that where we could really uplift our services was around education and outreach. So we were able to partner. What we did is, obviously, like most places, all of our events, all of our seminars went online to a virtual space. But what we did was we were like, wait, that means we can get people from all over the country. And what that means is we can partner with people from all over the country. So there's a group of, there's over 30 South Asian domestic violence organizations across our country. And anytime we did an event, we brought on one or two of those partners to do it with us. And that not only increased our audience, but it also showed solidarity between our groups and best practices between our groups, that we all really look at this issue as a public health crisis, that we look at this as something that is deeply rooted in power and control, in which victims should never be blamed. And we were able to get that collective message across in really big ways. And we were able to really connect with other people that were doing this exact work in these exact conditions. And it was, in a time where it's so hard to sustain our own mental health and our own well-being, the friendships that we formed doing that collective work became incredibly important. For survivors, I think even unemployment, food stamps, housing authority, all of that went virtual. So if you did not have internet access, you did not have access to technology, you were facing the biggest challenge possible. And I think that was a big lesson for us. And what we've learned is that we need to quickly get technology into the hands of clients, whether that looks like a laptop, that's best case scenario, or whether that looks like a smartphone that can be easily hidden. So instead of the burners that we used to use, now we're looking at how do we give out actual smartphones for people to be able to access data instead of just a flip phone.
And I guess on the topic of current events, the Me Too movement it's been here for a while, but in recent years it's gained a lot of traction. So have there been, I guess, any changes that Gaia has seen with regards to, I guess, the movement? Or
yeah, at the beginning we didn't see much. So back, and like you were saying, whenever was that, 2018, I guess, whenever that was. Time is very strange now because of the pandemic. But whenever, when the movement first started, most of our clients didn't resonate with that movement, and many of them didn't even know about it. And it was, this was a movement that was started by a Black woman, and then again, purposely or not, co-opted in a way by beautiful white actresses who could bring a lot of attention to it, much needed attention to it. And Time's Up was formed, and this legal defense fund, and all of that is great things. But what happened is that when somebody is telling their story on social media, because of the sort of the speed of which you have to make an impact, when you're working with folks that have language barriers or don't have like that, they're not writers, they're not performers, it is hard to tell your story in a way that is as impactful as Gwyneth Paltrow telling her story. And this doesn't take away from any of those stories that were told. But what I found was that none of our clients really resonated with the Me Too movement. Now, what slowly began to happen, and I've loved this, over the last few years, like just as that movement kind of started, and I thought, well, this is not going to mean anything to us. I love to be proven wrong. What we found is that as clients are experiencing failures within the system, within the legal system, within the criminal justice system, within the housing system, within the nonprofit system, as they are finding themselves not getting help or having negative help seeking experiences, not finding justice, they are more empowered now to tell their story. So I would say in the last 2 years, more than ever, we've had clients say, can I write a guest blog for you all? Do you have any opportunities where I can go and tell my story? And then on the flip side, we've had wonderful media partners who have said, okay, this issue is happening, whether it's COVID, whether it's SB8, reproductive justice, whether it's immigration crisis, Afghan refugees, right? Like it just, when reporters or media will come to us and say, do you have anyone willing to tell their story? Before, it would be really hard to find somebody. And now what I'm finding is that more people are empowered to tell that story. And I think it's an incredible thing. And it doesn't have to be, again, we're not finding it on maybe the South Asian survivor experience is not being told perhaps on Twitter in a format that's quick and has to be punchy and is impactful, but it's happening. And I do love that we're using storytelling as an alternative way to find some healing and justice. And I'm really proud of that, because I can't imagine taking the hardest and most harmful time in your life and going public with it simply to help other people. It's really remarkable.
And just to wrap up this interview, I'd just like to ask if you have a future vision for the organization, and also just provide you a space now if there's anything else you would like to share, or any final messages you would like to provide.
Yeah, my vision, I know a lot of people say it would be great if we were just out of business, if domestic violence just ended forever. And I don't, I think that this is rooted in patriarchy and powerful patriarchy that is centuries old. And so the idea that it will just go away, I think is, I don't think that that's possible. What I do hope is that we can start to move to a place where we're doing more education and prevention than we are doing crisis work, right? Because I hope to get ahead of the problem. I hope that, right now, DAIA offices, our address has to be confidential, because we have worked with clients who have had abusers that are like, I'm going to go there and find the person that's trying to help my spouse get away from me. And we've had, our founders, this is our 25th year, and it's our 25th anniversary. And I was talking to some of our founders, and they said, my goodness, at the time, they lost friends, they lost family just for creating DAIA, right? Not even for, it was just so controversial. And so I think we've made great progress. But what I would love is if DAIA could become a hub for the community to promote autonomy and healthy relationships, because I think those two things can and must live side by side together. I don't think that you can have one. I don't think you can have a healthy relationship without autonomy. I don't think that's possible. And so my vision is that we can become a less like scary space, that it doesn't have to be so like, oh my gosh, this is a place where people come when they're in complete crisis, that it can also be a place where people come when they want their preteens, children to learn what healthy relationships look like. And we do some of that work, but we do it out in the community. And I want to continue that and increase that so that we can start to reframe these societal norms where, girls have to play hard to get and guys need to push harder, and transgender folks don't feel like they fit in any of these constructs. I want a place where relationships of all kinds, healthy relationships, can be celebrated and used as models to then prevent abuse in the community. That's absolutely my vision. And I'm so excited that, as we're closing out our 25th year this year, and it's been, I stand really on the shoulders of our founders and community supporters that were there in 1996, losing friends and getting hate mail about this. And I feel that's why when I get, words of encouragement or emails thanking us, I share that with our founders, because that's really their victory as well. These are the things they should have been thanked for, but it wasn't part of the cultural norm to do that. So I don't think we're gonna, eliminate domestic violence forever. I think power and patriarchy is just too strong and too deep-seated and too ancient. But what I think we can do is collectively continue to celebrate the beauty of healthy relationships and push that as the norm, and really start working around prevention and empowering young people of all gender identities to really have that bottom line. The deal breaker is, you got to treat me with respect and equality. And I think that's doable. And I would love to be around that as in any way, shape or form, to see that when that happens.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today and telling us all about all the amazing work you guys do at that organization. So
thank you so much. It was great talking to you, and I appreciate you all capturing these stories, because I would love in 25 years to look back and say, oh, look, we did that. And so so it's beautiful to have these stories captured from our community. I think it makes the movement for immigrant rights and people of color just so much stronger, to capture the voices and stories of our communities.